Libertarians seem very diverse, but my issue with libertarianism is its one-sidedness. It doesn't understand the dialectic we just went over about how you need a very strong, powerful, and even socialist state that looks out for the interests of the people in order to curb the inevitable, and yes, inevitable growth of monopolies that arises from a normal capitalist economy. In order to maintain a moderately free market, you need a very strong and powerful state to curb the power of the various private interests that may emerge in the economy. I think American libertarians should help us reforge the Communist Party, because the Communist Party will allow for what the libertarians really want, which is they want to get rid of the state bureaucratic red tape. They want to get rid of the monopolies that are hurting the small guy. And they want to get the government off the backs of the people on an everyday local level. These are perfectly compatible with what communists want. Communists don't want the government to intervene and lord over people at the local and small level. Actually, if you look at China's governance, China is a very localistic type of state. China allows people, the Chinese government is not on people's back at the local level. It's very much promotes a culture of self-governance, and which is, of course, maintained by culture and other things. So that's my view of libertarianism. I don't think And another thing, too, is that even if we assume all of the values of the libertarians are correct, I don't believe American libertarians will ever accomplish any of their real goals. And it's simply because of that same one-sidedness. Libertarians don't recognize the necessity of maintaining a strong state, powerful state.
Yeah, but states inevitably become corrupt. That's sort of the point.
Even if states inevitably do become corrupt, the process of fighting corruption from the grassroots level, the level of the people, would become an inevitable part of the life cycle of a state. Actually, the conception of a state as a static thing is very modern. There's pre-modern views of a state, which is cyclical, that states become corrupt, the people put the state in check and somehow, and the cycle continues. I'll give you concrete examples of this from China alone. Just recently, Xi Jinping got to power on an anti-corruption campaign. He fought and rooted out corruption within the Chinese government. So instead of thinking this as a static thing, corruption, if it's inevitable, should be thought of as in a cyclical way. Corruption may inevitably occur, but at the same time, anti-corruption campaigns will inevitably arise. That's because in a communist state, the state does not consider itself all-powerful. The state recognizes that its power lies in the people. So there's a dynamic, ever-changing relationship between the state and the people. The state, unlike in America and in Western countries, doesn't pretend like it exists independently of the people and has no material foundation in the people.
So what you're saying is China is more libertarian than the U.S. is what
I
you're
think
saying.
so, yes.
With a big state.
Of course.
All right. And you're justifying that by saying that the Chinese government could come in and break up big companies. That's
an example of it, yes. And it also has a very wealthy, grassroots, popular culture of participating in civil life, civic life, holding corrupt entities accountable. The Chinese people, unlike what Western media was trying to say for the past few decades, are not a passive flock of sheep. They know they have a voice, they have opinions about their own country, and China's not perfect. I'm not trying to say it's perfect, but I think American libertarians would be much more interested in learning from China than they would learning from Europe or learning from wherever else, example.
Okay, but when we let the markets decide, that's demands of many people.
But you can't let a market decide when it comes to governance and statehood.
What do you mean by that?
Meaning, what do you mean? What would be the alternative? If markets inevitably lead to monopolies, markets inevitably lead to conditions.
For example, infrastructure.
Sorry,
you're letting infrastructure. We can let We can let private companies build roads and bridges and whatever else that China builds instead of
Well, then
having
why don't they? Where in the world do you find an example of private companies being able to build infrastructure with the level of efficiency that China does?
Well, they can't right now because the Western governments are so involved. But I'm saying if you let everything
the
go,
buck stops somewhere. The buck has to stop somewhere. And the fact of the matter is that private companies would be much less adept at building infrastructure because infrastructure doesn't work like a market. You don't, for example, when you drive on the highway, it's not a market decision. When you get your drinking water, it's not a market decision. Infrastructure is not a matter of going to a bazaar and making a consumer choice.
But businesses need those things, so they would inevitably build it. Google would build a road if they needed to get from one place to another. They would do it.
Okay, what's your point? But Google doesn't do that because Google relies on the infrastructure that already exists.
Yeah, but that's
which is much more efficient from a business perspective. They don't have to waste expenses. And that's why China's infrastructure policies are much more friendly to businesses because businesses don't have to create a state on their own. They can let the state take care of that at no cost to themselves besides taxes and stuff. And they won't have to build their own infrastructure. So let's take roads alone, for example, right? For Google to build its own infrastructure, Google needs educated people. It needs people who know how to build roads and so on. It needs that kind of things, right? It needs ownership of land, the land necessary to build the roads on. Somewhere along the lines, the buck stops somewhere where it requires some kind of state infrastructure, state institutions, which build the infrastructure for this to be possible. Because Google cannot build a state of its own, which A, provides complete education over how infrastructure works, technical engineers, provides all the raw materials necessary, secures the flow of raw materials, the supply chains that allow those to be somewhere along the line. The buck stops at geopolitics, statehood, things like that. The reason why we all suspect that Google would do a better job at building infrastructure than governments would in America is because our state in America is very outdated in general. Our laws are outdated, our government is outdated, and our infrastructure is definitely outdated. So if Google undertook the project of building its own infrastructure, it probably would maybe be better than the current infrastructure that exists now. But that would come at a tremendous cost to Google. I don't think Google would want to undertake that cost. I think Google wants the government to take care of that kind of thing so that Google can focus on the things that Google
they build campuses all across the world, and they foot that bill.
But their campuses are for working at Google.
Yeah, but I'm saying they can build it without taking 10 years like it does in the U.S. or 20 years or 30 years.
Sure, the U.S. The government in the U.S. is very outdated, but the government in China is not outdated like it is in the U.S. The infrastructure builders in China, their method and their ways is not outdated like it is in the U.S. China's an example of a state. China's state-owned enterprises and China's infrastructure building is an example of a state sector of the economy that in the world that is not actually outdated with regard to the private sector.
So you're saying that China is able to build infrastructure better than Google would be able to.
I think they are. Yes, if you look at the record, look at the past decade or two and how long it took China to create an extensive countrywide high-speed rail network. That is no easy task, my friend. That's not something countries do with ease. China is known and renowned throughout the world for the efficiency and speed with which it is able to build infrastructure.
I just don't find that moral that the government is doing this.
Why is it immoral?
Individuals should be able to determine.
You think that if a private company is building infrastructure, that this is an individual's doing? It's not an individual's doing. There's never an example of an individual.
The company started from an individual point of view. It started from a couple of people, right? It started from a founder.
The Communist Party was started from a few people. What's the point?
Yeah, but the Communist Party were elected. They didn't produce anything. They're not producers. Google only got to where they are because they provided
Google is
benefits to society.
I don't see what's so individual about Google whatsoever. Google is a company that's not controlled by any one individual, never was. And by the way, no individual made Google possible. A series of investors made Google possible. Not to discount the countless engineers and all those people who made it possible. It wasn't any one individual who made Google possible.
It does. Well, I mean, it's individual in the sense that it's by individual people that came up with.
Governments are by individual people as well.
Yeah, but the way of markets and the way free markets work. Or
Do you seriously believe that Google emerged out of a free market? Google was made possible by the infrastructure and network created between the United States, the military, and the research institutions during the Cold War. This is the infrastructure that made Google possible in the first place. Furthermore, do you really want to lead us to believe that Google arose out of some kind of consumer bazaar free market? No, Google arose out of a combination of government monopoly, shareholders and investors, and speculators who have nothing to do with any market that's accessible by ordinary people. So no, what you're saying is patently false. These big companies, these big tech companies are the worst example you're using of private enterprise and free markets, because the goddamn truth of the matter is that we as consumers don't really choose what these companies are even able to do. We don't even have a choice. Do you think the masses are happy with the big tech censorship that's going on?
I mean, not necessarily.
They're not, but we don't have an alternative. We have no alternative. There's no free market to choose an alternative to that.
You don't have to use Google.
You don't, but you're going to be isolated from the world. And I know about all of the alternative websites right-wingers like to use. They like to use, Gab and what else? But those are failures. They're all failures.
But they're still alternatives. And there's
but they're not alternatives that will ever able to rival these monopolies, these big tech monopolies.
I mean, but that's the market, right? People get to decide.
This is where you got it wrong, because it's precisely not because of the market, because these big tech companies have a monopoly, and this monopoly goes very deep. It's not just that people prefer to use them. They have partnerships with other companies. They have special relationships with the government. They have special relationships with the local governments of countries, whole states, like in California. So no, Google and these Facebook and all these big tech companies have not gained the prominence they have because of the free market. They've done so because of their monopolies.
I mean, I do agree that the U.S. has definitely been a huge investor in some of these companies. But that's just because that's what we live in right now in America. But what I'm saying is, even if it was a completely free market, Google and Amazon and these companies would still be large. And they would still,
but they're monopolies.
They're
monopolies which hurt free markets, and monopolies were only able to be challenged by the power of government. So I agree. There's a lot of red tape and bureaucracy in America that doesn't need to be there. I 100% agree with that. But one-sidedly saying you're just going to get rid of those and let things be, to me, you're just going to end up with a catastrophic situation in which you're going to have the unfettered rule of monopolies, and it's going to stifle the ability for ordinary people to have a chance.
But can you agree that could have been technological too? You don't know that if that would be the case now. The individual person has a lot more. The individual person has a lot more at their disposal that they didn't have in those times. They didn't.
What do you mean?
Whether it's cell phones, whether it's the ability for them to be independent contractors like you probably are as a streamer. You weren't able to do this before. So even if we had zero laws or all of these crazy policies that we have in place, you would still be able to make money on Twitch. Nothing's stopping you.
No, I wouldn't. I really wouldn't, because Twitch, you're trying to isolate something from the greater whole. You're not seeing the bigger picture. You're not seeing the bigger picture and how big tech, as it currently exists, relies upon the government to maintain itself.
So you're saying that Twitch wouldn't exist without the government?
I don't think it would. No.
How do you justify that? You can just say that, but there's no. I don't see any proof behind that.
Okay, sure. What makes Twitch possible? Let's begin from there.
I mean, before even Amazon bought it, Twitch was, it started from the ground, right?
Sure. What makes Twitch possible?
What do you mean by that? What you mean technologically, or the company? I mean,
Any kind of way.
I mean, just the advancement of technology. I mean, there are a couple of guys.
Let's be specific.
I mean, what I mean is a couple of guys, entrepreneurs, started a company to allow people to stream on their platform.
Okay, you sound like a guy who's never looked at the ground upon which their feet stands. You think that you're just floating in midair. You don't stand on some kind of ground.
So you're saying even for the ability...
Be more specific. What makes Twitch possible?
What do you mean by that?
The internet is what makes Twitch possible.
Okay.
Who created the internet?
Okay, the government. Yeah.
Okay. What else? Yes. Okay, let's forget about the technological software side of things. Even though we're skipping a lot of important details, let's look at the hardware side of things. What makes the internet possible?
So you're wanting me to debate from what happened. I'm saying
what makes the internet possible?
Isn't Elon Musk shooting up?
What makes the internet possible? Can you answer?
I mean, what do you mean by that?
Computers.
Okay. So yeah, governments created a lot of these things.
It's not just that governments created them. It's that the supply chains necessary for our computers to be built are geopolitically maintained by the American state and negotiated at the level of the American state. If you don't have a state, your supply chains that allow you to secure the raw materials necessary to even build the fucking things falls apart.
How? So you're saying that there wouldn't be supply?
Because the U.S. government is what negotiates on the world level, or negotiates is maybe a bad word because that assumes they're doing so as equals. They're using their big stick to make American companies have the best deal when it comes to securing raw materials.
Okay, but
to build the fucking computers. Trade. You don't know about the significance of government in relation to negotiating trade?
Individual companies could do the exact same things you're saying.
No, they can't. An individual company would never be able to establish something like the IMF. An individual company would never be able to establish something like the World Trade Organization. An individual company would never be able to do something like negotiate the level at which countries participating can institute tariffs and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, in a way, transnational corporations could do those things.
They couldn't. How could they? Without being sovereign political states and powers in and of themselves. Because remember, these are things, trade policy is something a sovereign state does to overdetermine what the companies within it are allowed to do. Not just one company choosing for itself what it's going to do, but all the companies within the state.
Yeah, you're explaining what's happening now, which I don't disagree with. What I'm saying is if we were in a more free market society, we could still do those things.
No, okay, how could you? Please give me a hypothetical example of how you could do that.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying like the internet, how the government created an internet and whatnot, which is obviously true. But I
said a whole lot of things. I talked about the supply chains. I talked about the relationship between trade policy that makes it all possible in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, all of that. But I'm saying individuals can do that too. You see Elon Musk, starting his own...
Elon Musk would not be more than a fucking sewer rat were it not for the U.S. government subsidies and funding he received. Were it not for the partnerships and collaboration he's able to establish with NASA, his fucking rockets would never be able to leave the ground. So no, Elon Musk is not an example of an individual just doing things on his own. That's probably the worst example you could give me. No, but even if it was, Elon Musk, again, relies upon the trade policies, the monopolies and state policies at the level of the U.S. government geopolitically that allows him to have anything in the first place. I'll give you an example of this. What does Elon Musk need for his cars? He needs lithium. Where do you find lithium? Well, you find it in other countries. One of those countries is Bolivia. The U.S. helped orchestrate a coup in Bolivia so Elon Musk could have access to the lithium there. How is Elon Musk going to do that all by himself? He needs a state to do it.
So you're saying individual companies can't negotiate with states? Is that what you're saying?
No, not with the efficacy that which states are going to. And by the way, you're going to create a chaotic scenario. If states are only going to be able to negotiate with individual companies, Somewhere along the line, there's going to be a conflict of interest because there's millions and millions of companies, and there's only one state they're negotiating with. It doesn't make any sense for this would never be able to replace trade policies and bilateral agreements between states when it comes to trade.
I mean, depending on the size of the corporation, it could basically sort of have the power of the state.
No, it couldn't.
I mean, it could.
It would not be a state then. In no meaningful sense would it be a state.
If there is only one company out there that is shooting satellites up into space, they're gonna, whether it's if it's a company, they're gonna negotiate with Bolivia, for example, and it's gonna be just that one company doing so. I mean, companies.
What does this company exist in the Aether? Which country is this company based in?
I mean, in this hypothetical, I guess it would be the U.S. or what.
So the U.S. You don't think that Tesla has to comply with the United States national security regime? You don't think that Tesla has to comply with the interests of what's established by the U.S. government? You don't think that the U.S. government itself is what's propping up Tesla?
I mean, it is right now, yeah, but that's because we're in crony capitalism, as you mentioned earlier. But I'm saying in my ideal society, there would be no state doing that. I'm saying individual corporations would have the ability to negotiate. And guess what? The best.
But I think that's precisely where we're finding a problem here. You're saying my ideal society, but as an individual, your perspective is very limited. You're not taking into account into how all of these things you're describing rely and interdepend upon each other. It's easy from your individual perspective to isolate one thing and say, oh, I just want that without all the blemishes. Oh, I just want the ice cream without the cows that make it possible, without the grass that feeds those cows. You're isolating one thing that you like from the greater whole with which it depends. This is why it's wrong to think in terms of individually contrived ideals. And it's important to take into account a more material, scientific analysis of the greater whole.
Well, I think individuals are smart enough to, even if we didn't have a state, individuals would be smart enough to be able to.
You speak of individuals as though an individual isn't a being that's crawled out of some woman's pussy. You're speaking of an individual like an individual doesn't have a mother. You're speaking of an individual as if an individual raises and clothes themselves. You're speaking of an individual as though at one point in their life they weren't a screaming infant that was absolutely nothing. There's no such thing as an isolated individual in the history of humanity. And there's certainly no such thing as an isolated individual when it comes to modern economies of scale. Individuals rely upon... Now, of course, individual brilliance is a huge part of the world and of societies.
Yeah, but
an individual initiative is a huge factor. But individuals alone can't do anything. I don't see how the state necessarily stifles individual talent. I can see how it can do that, but only insofar as the state colludes with the prevailing economic powers that be. If the state works in the interests of the people at the expense of those prevailing economic powers, then as a matter of fact, the state is probably the only instrument with which individuals can be freed from the shackles of the everyday institutional and established economic powers and burdens which do stifle their ability to draw out their potential. So I think the state is actually a weapon with which individuals can express their inherent and latent potentials.
Okay, so when a state goes to war with another state and bombs and kills millions of people, those millions of people that they killed, you're telling me that they didn't objectively, stifle some individual.
On whose behalf does America go to war and kill millions of people?
Yeah, I'm not saying just.
It's on behalf of what?
Oil.
It's on behalf of oil cartels. It's on behalf of Wall Street. It's on behalf of the rich and the powerful and the established economic interests that be. China isn't a country that goes in and bombs millions of people.
Yeah, I'm not saying China specifically. I'm saying the state itself.
But the states, we can actually confine the realm of states who do that to a limited set.
Okay. So you do agree to an extent that the state will stifle progress to some degree.
The state, only insofar as it is in collusion with the established economic powers, yes, is a profound tool with which progress, development, and human flourishing is stifled. America is an example of that. But all I'm trying to say is that this is not something specific to states in the abstract or states in and of themselves, but a state, rather, which is consolidated and controlled and serves the interests of established economic powers. This does not reflect on states in general.
Well, my overall point is that we just need to allow individuals to maximize their abilities, and the states stifle that. States stifle that just with their policy. It could be unintended.
But I don't see what your point is. We agree that states, in collusion with established economic powers, stifle individual initiative. States, which act in the interests of the people at the expense of those powers, allow for the individual initiative to flourish. So I don't see what's so relevant about the state. It's not just the state that stifles the individual initiative. The key part is the established economic order in general and established economic interests and powers which do that.
Yeah, but it's not just economics that make the state so powerful. If it was, you know what I mean? It's not just economic. It's also other,
Well, the issue is it's not about how powerful the state is. It's to what extent does the state act to supplement economic powers, parasitic economic powers that need the state to subsist. That's the point. The reason why the American state is so powerful in stifling individual or small businesses, for example, is because because these big corporations would not survive on their own in a so-called free market. So they rely upon the big stick, the American state, to maintain their monopolies.
I don't agree with that. I mean, you can if the United States dissolved right now, Google would still be here in some form.
I promise you, I am willing to promise you something. If the United States dissolved, absolutely no big tech company would survive. Absolutely none of them. Not Google, none of them. Absolutely none.
They may not in the form that they're in right now.
No, they would not survive whatsoever. Do you know what a corporation is?
I mean, I know the corporation itself is a government.
No. I mean, what do you know what a corporation, what it means for a company to be incorporated?
Yeah, I mean, I do get it conceptually. I understand that the government, that is a government.
Governments sort of incorporate companies.
Yeah, that's a government instrument. I understand that. But what I'm saying is, you can call it whatever you want. But
how would Google maintain anything? Google doesn't even have its own police force. If 50 homeless people ran into Google's headquarters naked, they have to call the police. You're saying if the whole American state collapsed, Google would still be around? No, they wouldn't.
Yeah, but I mean, so you're saying there are no security companies out now? You're saying there wouldn't be a market for security?
That was just an example of the way and how much Google depends not only on the federal government, but the local California, not only the local California government, the local city government.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is there would be a market for that. Obviously, if it dissolved, there would be a market for it.
That's one thing. I'm trying to tell you, Google would not be able to survive. Google depends upon the U.S. government to survive.
Yeah, currently, but what I'm saying
is not currently. The whole organizational apparatus of the company and the corporation, how it pays its employees, the whole fucking thing from top to bottom would collapse. Nothing would be able to be sustained. Nothing. Google isn't just one guy hiring companies. Google is a system. It's a corporation from the shareholders down. None of that would be sustained because the underlying systemic matrices that they're coming from and they're operating within are defined by laws, defined by the institutions of the U.S. government.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that's how it's set up right now. But what I'm saying
No, it's not just right now. What central organ of Google would survive if the U.S. government collapsed? What is the central nucleus called Google which would survive? All of the employees who have to be laid off, because the underlying fucking institutional ability to hire people, the process of hiring people, the process of negotiating contracts with your employers. Not this is forgetting about the whole investors and all that kind of stuff, by the way, which alone would collapse the whole fucking thing. We're just going to assume the company's going to be able to operate without the shareholders and investors, which is a joke in and of itself. Do you understand how much laws permeate everyday economic life?
Yeah, I'm not saying that you would see Google.
How is Google going to define the extent and sphere in which it even owns property? Why should anyone respect Google's claims as to its ownership of property? That whole records of Google's property ownership is indexed by local and state and federal governments. What about Google's intellectual property? That's probably the biggest one. Who's going to enforce Google's intellectual property?
Well, I guess they would.
No, they wouldn't. They would have no way of doing that. Short of becoming a state in and of themselves. They would have no way of doing that. What is Google going to do? Put people on fucking Toyota trucks armed with machine guns and go attack small startups to enforce their intellectual? It's complete. What we are talking about is an absurdity right now. What we are talking about is literally an absurdity. If warlords are running around with pickup trucks and machine guns shooting everything, how is there going to be a stable infrastructure network that's going to survive all that? Is everyone just going to agree, like in Pirates of the Caribbean, they're going to have the Pirates Code, that we're just not going to fuck with the infrastructure that we're fighting over?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to debate.
I'm just trying to explain to you the decisive significance of states in relationship to the possibility of what you call an economy or a free market.
I understand. It's hard to debate this with people because obviously I have to use hypotheticals in a sense because there's no free market society that we live in now. So of course you're going to
there has never been one in the history of mankind.
When you're using examples of what exists now. So
but there's never one that existed in the history of mankind either.
Yeah, I know, because there's people that always want power. And it turns into a state.
But at what point do you just stop complaining about that and you just accept that a state is an objective reality which cannot be childishly wished away but must be soberly accepted and dealt with and actually confronted as a reality? At what point do you draw the line and say, maybe it is futile to try and completely eliminate the state or abolish the state. Maybe I should recognize that the state, at least the one we have now, is an objective one and must be respected on those terms. The state is objective and therefore undergoes its own development in an objective way. You can pretend the state doesn't exist, so you can close your ears and close your mouth and pretend nothing exists. But ultimately, states exist, and they even survive the destruction of governments. Stalin has a great quote. He says, "The Hitlers of history come and go, but the German people and the German state survive." And Stalin said this because even despite the Nazi takeover of Germany, the German state, its continuity of laws, its continuity of governingship, its continuity of history somehow survives objectively. Even when the Nazis collapse, the continuity of the German state is continued. So there's something objective about states.
Yeah, I'm not saying
states are not reducible to the current government you have. The current government or the current state machinery that's in place is not the same as the state as a real and objective historical continuity.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily saying to abolish it outright. I'm saying diminish it to a point where it's not the state that we recognize that it is now.
I agree with that, but I think only a communist party can do that.
You're saying that libertarians they're more utopian in the sense that there's no way to be.
That's my point. My point is not that libertarians have ill intentions. It's that they're too utopian about their intentions. They're utopian in the same way you have utopian communists who think that you can just eliminate markets or commodities overnight, and you can just have private anything overnight, and who think that the state can be abolished overnight. So I consider it the same type of utopianism.
Yeah, well, I don't necessarily think the state can be abolished overnight. I don't even think you can abolish the state as it currently is now. There's no individual libertarian that's strong enough to be able to dismantle the United States, for example. But you can cut down on policies and large government red tape that we have now. So
Okay, I don't disagree, but what I disagree about is how that would be done.
I mean, I guess in the current system, you would have to have politicians that agree to cutting down. Like Ron Paul, for example.
But the point I'm trying to say is that I don't think that you're going to be able to break the current reigning monopoly capital in collusion with the state. I don't think you're going to be able to cut down on the state bureaucracy and red tape that exists both on the federal and state level and all of this ugly corruption. I don't think you're going to be able to get rid of this without a strong and powerful people's movement. And my idea for this movement is a revived communist party.
I mean, from what you're saying, it doesn't sound too bad. If you're telling me that the state is not going to be corrupt and they're going to be able to facilitate individuals to be able to trade. If that's what you're
definitely
saying,
a people's state, a state that serves the people and allows the people to flourish instead of keeping them down.
I mean, it sounds idealistic in a sense, because I don't think that's what actually happens in reality. It's probably sort of like China, for example. That's what they pitch, but I'm not sure that's how it actually works.
Well, it's not in a one-sided way, because like I said, there does exist corruption in China, but there also exists anti-corruption campaigns. I am not of the view that you're going to create a utopia and then everything's going to be fine. It's an active process which never ends.
So you're saying a sort of a small revolution every single time there's a batch of corruption. That's
sure, not just every time there's a batch of corruption, but whenever there's a consolidation of some kind of establishment in general, yes, you do have a social or cultural revolution. But this revolution doesn't always have to lead to the overthrow or collapse of the state. It can be a more subtle type of revolution, like the revolution of the Xi era recently. And this is a revolution that's happening in China now. It's just not one that's resulted in violence or the complete overthrow of the Chinese state.
All right. Well, I mean, from what it
in
sounds
Maoism,
great.
There's an idea of a antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradiction. In a non-antagonistic contradiction, you still have a great struggle and you still have a conflict, but it doesn't realize itself in overt and explicit forms of violence and conflict and all this, and direct armed conflict and even street conflict and this kind of stuff. It's a more subtle type of struggle and conflict.
All right. Well, I mean, it sounds great. Again, it sounds great, but what you're explaining to me now could be just as idealistic as a libertarian society.
I think it's less, but the reason I think it's less idealistic is because despite that China is not a perfect society, China exists, and it's an example we can look to as a society that has more or less succeeded in this.
Well, I would need proof for that, but you can.
I recommend you learn more about China then. If you want to see an example of a successful version of a society that I'm talking about. And by the way, this isn't my ideal. I'm saying all this because I learned from China and how it works.
I don't see entrepreneurs from all over the world moving to China.
Listen, the idea of open borders existing freely and unmitigated movement of peoples, were it not for government restrictions, is a myth. There's no such thing. Because let me tell you something. To even travel, airplanes are out of the question because airports and all that kind of stuff, those don't exist without governments, right? Air travel regulation, all that kind of stuff, that's not possible without governments. So we would have to travel by boat. It's just not economical for people to just do that at the scale you're talking about. It's not.
I mean, I don't know why you would say that there would be no air travel with that.
There wouldn't, because we don't want to get into this discussion. Because, first of all, airport security, you need federal state regulations. Regulations about aircraft being safed, you need federal regulations. And before you say let the free market decide, I don't think fucking people want to be the test subjects to see which planes work and which ones don't. I think they just want the planes to fucking work before they even think about stepping foot on them.
I mean, if a company is known to have bad airplanes, people would stop.
Yeah, but how are you going to be known to have bad airplanes if not, people stepping on, someone's going to have to be sacrificed, and I don't think people want to be sacrificed.
Yeah, they
I don't listen. Look, I'm trying to help you, even though I don't have any obligation to. Like I said in the beginning, I'm trying to help you right now. Please do not try to sit here and argue for a free market of airplanes. Okay?
No, we can go here because.
Okay, we have to. Okay, let's go here then. Please, let's go here.
All right. Well, first, people already die in airplanes now.
Okay, but much more would die if there was a free market of airplanes.
You don't know that.
Yes, I do know that. Because the fucking federal regulations, which are a burden and expense on these companies, would not be in place. And you would see a lot of tragedies and horrible things happening that just don't need to exist.
There are markets out there that there are.
Listen, it's less expensive to make a shitty plane than one that complies with federal regulations. So yeah, somewhere along the line, there's going to be a problem. Okay.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is we would have more efficient planes.
No, you wouldn't. I don't think you would. A plane is a very simple fuck. Do you even know, like, how planes are made? Do you actually think planes are like fruit? You think planes are like, no, planes require a lot of institutional, infrastructural, just to make them requires so much of that, right?
Yeah.
And that alone relies on the government. The institutions that educate all this, the network, everything. You need government to make planes.
You know there are private plane companies now, right? Like, this isn't some abstract thing.
Yes, I know they're private, but I'm saying they can't exist without the government.
I mean, the government is currently involved in all of these things. But
we can agree. Okay, but then if we get to the piece by piece, every single way in which they're dependent on the quote unquote current government, at one point you're gonna find yourself having to stretch to say that private companies can replace everything.
Yeah, I mean, again, you can't prove your statements. I mean, it can sound great, but
I'm trying to have a reasonable, common sense discussion with you. I don't want to have to get to the point of proof because it's going to be so humiliating for you. So let's just focus on common sense.
All right, we'll just move on. All right.
Let's focus on common sense. All right, a free market of airplanes is a very silly idea. Okay?
Okay. All right, well, in that case, like I said, even if it does have to come to a point where the government would have to put, regulation in place, it would be very simple. It would not be, thousands and thousands of pages of laws. I
don't know to what extent federal aviation regulations are too burdensome or not. I think it would have to be investigated, but I'm just trying to tell you that we got to this point because I talked about how air travel can't exist without governments.
Yeah, again, if we're gonna say, I just want to strip down as much regulation as possible. So if you're telling me that air travel has to have government, then let's have some regulation in place.
Okay, but then my point was, government is not stifling people from moving to China.
What I'm saying is, China is objectively stifling an entrepreneur's ability to move there if they chose.
Okay, but that entrepreneur has no entitlement to the territory of China.
Yeah, but why does the state get to determine that?
Because states serve the people, and states define the extent to which people own their country.
Or you're saying the average person?
You're saying countries should no longer exist, and businessmen should be able to carve up the world according to how much money they have at the expense of people's tradition. You realize states and borders, right? Borders are defined by war. Borders are defined by sacrifice. Borders are defined by history, tradition, culture. All of this is meaningless to you.
I mean, I think the individual right for people to be able to move freely is more important than everything you just mentioned.
Who guarantees this right, if not a supra-global state of some kind, which dissolves the realities of each and every nation and country into thin air and says that it's a free-for-all?
I mean, again, we would go to hypothetical, and that question would lead us to a hypothetical situation. So,
This is listen, people will never accept this. People will never accept this. The people will never accept this.
again, I'm not saying make the entire world stateless. I'm saying we can start with the U.S., for example, or even if U.S. isn't not an good example.
You need to realize, anomaly, you're a citizen of America. America is your home. You have a say in America. China does not belong to you. You have no right to China. You have no right to any other country.
Okay, so yeah, I mean
This is the country you are legally a citizen of.
yeah, that's how it is right now. Yeah,
This is the country you have tradition and your culture and your whole being comes from. Just like your mother gave birth to you, that's your mother. This is the land that gave birth to you. You understand?
I mean, you're saying that, but land. I mean, this is just a piece of land. It's not.
No,
anything.
it's the land that gave birth to you. It's the air you breathe. It's the food you eat. It's the place you grew up in. It's the people you know. It's everything that defines you.
I've lived in like 10 different countries before. So
Okay.
just because I was born here, that doesn't
Well,
necessarily.
then it's a matter of the laws, because we need some kind of laws to determine this.
What I'm saying is, I was able to travel.
Maybe
freely.
you're less homegrown than others, but legally speaking, you're an American.
Okay. So what? That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have the ability to move.
You
wherever
have
we
no
want.
business in any other country in terms of having the right to do this or that. That's up to the people of that country and its government. And the government that they assent to.
Okay. Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily.
You're
mean it's a
taking
good
your
thing.
problem is that
making-
you're making it seem like nations and states don't exist. And that's fine and well ideally, but to a Chinese person, you're a foreigner. You come from a foreign state and a foreign country. So for you to say you want to have the unconditional right to do whatever you want in China as an entrepreneur at the expense of the
I
Chinese
should have
people.
the right. I'm not saying that. I'm not forcing it on them. I'm saying that.
No, I'm saying, but you're saying they're stifling your right, and you have a right to China.
No,
You
I'm
don't
saying
have
I
any such right.
No, I'm saying I should have the right to be able to move to wherever I want. I'm not saying that I
You-
do, but I should.
You should. How could it be a right if it's just a matter of should?
I mean, we can.
You
do
think
it in the
rights?
US.
Okay, then what is a right? Is right then? If it's just should, then according to your own words, a right is something rather than natural and God-given, something purely instantiated in the state's recognition. The state grants you your rights and your not rights. You're saying you should have the right rather than you have the right. If you should have the right, who's going to give you that right?
Well, I mean, right now it would be the state, obviously, but that's because. we're
So who
talking
will
about
give you the
now.
right?
What?
Who will give you the right?
Well, I mean, right now it's the state, right?
So you want the state to give you the right as an entrepreneur to
I'm
move to
saying
China and
that-
do whatever you want?
Well, I mean, objectively, that's how it would work, right? If someone wants to move to the U.S. has to accept them. I'm saying countries should be able or should allow people to be able to move wherever they want.
Why?
We should,
The Chinese state exists for the Chinese people.
yeah, but I don't. Agree
Those
with
are the
that. And I don't
people
think-
it actually has a material foundation in, and it knows and it's accustomed to, and it came from. The Chinese state has nothing to do with people.
You're basically
The Chinese
romantic-
state has nothing to do with people living in Idaho.
Yeah, but you're basically romanticizing like someone's birthplace, which
I'm not
I don't-
romanticizing it. I'm telling you the plain truth.
Yeah, but
A
that's what you're-
state is not just an abstraction. It doesn't come out of thin air. A state comes from a people, and it's a reflection of a people. Like
Well,
you
I
look in
mean-
the mirror, that's a reflection of you. A state is a reflection of a people.
I mean, explain the U.S. then, because cities that I live in.
The U.S. is the best example because the U.S. is a state which pretends to be completely abstract universal, but as we can see, it's a highly racialized state. It's a highly culturalized state. It has highly particular features, Anglo-American features, African-American, Latino-American. All of these specific determinate people define the American state.
Yeah, but the cities I live in, I see people from all across the world.
But your cities are not the majority. The majority of the American people, whether they're black, white, or Latino, have culture, tradition, and roots here.
Okay. I mean, I'm not seeing this. I'm not sure. You maybe the country folk maybe.
You're not seeing this? Do you know that black people have roots and tradition in the Black Belt, which is what it's called historically in the South, the Black Belt? And that, did you know that, do you know about Appalachia? Do you know about how the countryside is the other half of the whole fucking population? And that the people in the cities, by and large, came from the countryside? And that, yes, there's other immigrants and foreigners and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, maybe people aren't freely moving, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't. My whole point is that individuals should have rights. You can't tell me what to do, just like I can't tell you what to do.
An individual is part of a greater whole. Just like you have a mother and you didn't give birth to yourself.
Okay, but now I exist, and I should have the right to do what I want, and you should have the right to do what you want. I shouldn't be able to tell you.
There is no such thing as an unconditional right to do whatever you want.
Yeah, it doesn't exist now, but
it can never exist.
I mean, it can.
No, it can't, because in addition to social limit and not only familial and communal, but also social restrictions on the sphere of doing what you want to do, there's also objective and natural ones.
Okay.
It's very childish what you're saying.
I mean, what I'm saying is conceptually. So you're telling me I should be able to come down and tell you what to do. I should be able to rule over you is what you're saying.
What do you mean by that?
If I happen to be...
No, you're an individual. A state is not an individual.
I mean, individuals aren't the only ones that rule over other people in the sense that corporations do. Corporations also do that.
Families do too.
Yeah, families do too, exactly. So I mean, I guess to a sense, families, you have to have that. But what I'm saying is, me as an individual should not have to force you to do anything. You should be able to do what you want.
Okay, wait. But here's the issue. You as an individual are a private interest. So for you to exercise your authority over me, another private individual, would mean that you're exercising some arbitrary power to limit and stifle, and in this undignified way, my private interests, even though we're both equals. But a state is not a private interest. It's precisely not a private interest. So if the state is not a private interest, it does not act over you as though another private individual is. My job as a private individual is to do what? It's to live my life, make a living, find a girl, marry her, have a family, raise kids, whatever, right? Just like you're a man. That's what you're here for, right?
Exactly. Okay, yeah.
That's not the state's job. The state's job is to make sure we have a society that makes this possible.
Okay.
So if a state is ruling over me, it's not the same as if just some other man ruling over me.
But individuals exercise the state power to rule over us. So individuals are the ones that are coming down and enforcing this on us. It's not the concept of the
individual state. Actors are the instrument of state. No, states are not reducible to individuals. They're not.
I mean, but who are the ones that are actually implementing these things?
It's no single one person.
I mean, it might not be, but that police officer that arrests you, he represents the state, but he is the one enforcing. He's the one enforcing it.
Yeah, but the whole state power is not reducible to him.
So now I see that as an individual.
A state is a shared convention, external convention. The metaphysics of statehood and its true substance is an old topic. Is the state just a collection of individuals, or is it a supra-organic whole that individuals are merely a part of? This is a kind of metaphysical question. But if we rely on our common sense, we can see the state is not just individuals or the sum total of private individual interests. It's some kind of external objective interest.
I mean, you can say that, but I'm saying individuals don't see it that way when it happens to them. If a police officer,
of course, but here's the kicker here. One of the reasons for that is because in America, for example, we all see the state as a private interest. That we see the government specifically as a private interest. We don't see it as a people's state. We see it as a government completely alienated from any of us. It doesn't serve our interests. It serves the interests of men in dark suits who we will never have any idea who they are. And they exist at our expense. This is how people see the state in capitalistic, or you don't like that word, monopolistic, imperialistic countries.
Okay, I mean, yeah, I don't totally disagree with that, but I mean, I do like these conversations, right? Because I learn new things. I didn't know much of your perspective.
Oh, I agree. You didn't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so some of the things you said sounded good about China, you know, and whatnot, and so
Okay.
I'll look into that stuff. I'll look into it, but
Okay, look into it.
yeah. So all right. Well, I mean, it was good, nice talking to you.
Okay.
All right.